It's really an honor to work with the ITEN group and the Organization of American States. I bring you greetings from Cal State Long Beach in Southern California. Before we get started, I'm going to post a link in the chat area. This is a link that you can copy and obtain. You can obtain the different materials that I'm referring to in the presentation. It's downloadable for free, so I hope you can take advantage of that. I want to send out greetings to all of you in different countries. Just want you to know that in February I'll be visiting Guatemala. So if you're going to the conference put on by the Guatemalan Reading Association, I hope to see you there in February. So let's get started. First of all, let's think about what is foundational reading. There's different aspects of reading. Foundational deals with 4 areas: print concepts, phonological awareness, phonics and word recognition, and fluency. Print concepts deals with that aspect where the student demonstrates an understanding of the organization and basic features of print. They also see print as significant. I don't know if you've ever seen a child where you hold a book in front of them and they look at it and they just don't see the significance of that print. That's someone who really is at the lowest level of print concepts. It also deals with the basic development of the letters and words and on a visual basis. Phonological awareness is a linguistic term dealing with phonemes, or those meaningful components of words and syllables and sounds. These, I think I'd like to underline the word that demonstrates understanding. It's not just parroting back the appropriate sounds, but understanding what those sounds mean. Phonics and word recognition go hand in hand. There's 2 sides there. Phonics is actually more of a commercial term than a linguistic term. It's a popular term, and it deals with the actual sounds in terms of decoding words. Word analysis is part of that word recognition. That's the sight part. In English, it's interesting that it's not always what you see is how things sound. For example, just the word read. It could be spelled read, or it could be spelled the same way and be pronounced as read. You have to know that from the context. It's not just about parroting sounds again. Fluency, that's where the reader can read with accuracy in a way that supports comprehension, but there's also a sense of self-correction. There's a fluidity about that, and there's a sense of voice in the reading. These work together for those fundamental concepts of reading. But let me just say something, that reading doesn't begin with these 4. Reading really begins at those earliest stages when a child is developing their mind, and they begin to read the emotions of those around them. They begin to read the lay of the land. These are very non-linguistic kinds of ways that the brain develops to read faces. Reading is a mental process, and it's very much tied to thinking. We'll get into that in just a moment here. Talking more about foundational reading, one of the ways that I've gotten my head around the concept of foundational reading is to think about it in terms of performance level descriptors for each of these components. And I'm going to be referring to 3 performance levels. Level 3 is when a student is operating at the expected grade level for foundational skills. And level 2 is when we have them developing those foundational skills, but not operating at an expected grade level. Level 1 is when those skills are entirely undeveloped and really need a lot of work. So I'm dealing with these sort of in reverse order, level 3 being the highest and level 1 being the lowest. I've developed some performance level descriptors in my book, and you can see those with that link that I provided. I'll have these available for you. But these are based on starting with the anchor content standards for foundational reading, and I'll be referring basically to the standards that come from the Common Core in the United States. I'm sure at your own countries that you have competencies or standards that you refer to, but it's those anchor levels that we'll work back from. And here they are. You'll notice, and this is available via the link that I've supplied, I've got performance level. Let me use an arrow to point here. And so I've got performance level 3 down the right-hand column. For example, in print concepts, a grade level expected performance is it demonstrates understanding of the basic organization and features of print. For phonological awareness, that the student demonstrates understanding of spoken words, syllables, and sounds and phonemes. Phonics and word recognition, that the student knows and applies grade level phonics and word analysis skills. And then in fluency, that they read with sufficient accuracy and fluency to support comprehension and self-correction. But if you work backwards, and I'll continue with fluency there, that reads simple text with some accuracy, pacing, and expression, and only corrects some errors, that's a level 2 performance. Level 1 performance is unable to decode simple words in a sentence. Let's compare that with print concepts. I'm going to go up to print concepts. A level 2 is to see words as separated by spaces and can track words from left to right. You name upper and lower case alphabet, identifies ending punctuation. These are all basic concepts related to reading, but a level 2 will have some of these skills, but not all in place. A level 1 student does not recognize print is significant and does not track words from left to right, and names a few or no alphabet letters, and probably doesn't know how to write his or her name, and there's no use of any punctuation. As you can see, this becomes a way of doing a quick analysis or evaluation of a student's reading ability. As we ask them to read, we can look at these behaviors and identify at what level the student's reading at. This will be helpful in terms of deciding what steps to take, where do I need to work on with the student. And I wanted to combine all 4 of these concepts into a single page so that teachers have quick access to this evaluation tool. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit more about print concepts. Historically, print started as pictures. We have, for example, a picture for the word head, to walk, legs, a cycle of a day. These were pictures more than letters. But over time, these pictures began to form letters. You begin to see, here's kind of the shape of a letter L for lion. For these types of shapes began to be used to form letters, but they only formed consonants. Consonants carried meaning. Look at this word here. You could probably easily decipher this word without knowing the vowels. The word captain. But if you look at the same word with missing the consonants, you see that there's no meaning there. There are some letters that you recognize, but deciphering what is this word is really impossible. Look at this. You can probably, with the consonants, figure out what the word this is. What this tells us is that in terms of meanings, children will develop understanding of print first with consonants. In fact, that shows up in their writing too. A semi-phonetic type of writer will write with groups of consonants together. They may want to say the word snowman, and that'll be spelled S-W-M-N without any vowels. Here's the word double. You probably figured that one out. But if I look at double with just vowels, there's no meaning. Look at this word here. You recognize it immediately without the vowel. Just the vowel by itself doesn't help you understand. So this tells us something about the way print develops. It begins with visuals and pictures, letter formation, consonants, but then vowels are added later to add to the sounds. Print concepts are very visual. The sounds are not really germane to print concept in the same way. Let's move on. Let's get into the sounds. Now I put together this chart for the various vowel sounds that you find in English. Now, one of the things that I highly recommend is that although we're talking about sounds for reading, in order to get across sounds, the mistake is to try to teach sounds via another sound. So I try to get somebody to recognize the ah in cat, and I start saying that over and over again. 9 times out of 10, the student will not pick up what the ah is. What works much better is understanding the position of the mouth. In other words, there's a feel that happens in the mouth, in the tongue, and the lips. So I put together this chart for every one of the vowel sounds, not just the 5 vowels, but the actual vowel sounds, because there's a difference between a and a. And the difference is in the position of the mouth, where a is like a wide open smile, a, and a is closed, is more closed. These are related words, and these are varieties of ways that the letter combinations represent that sound. Again, this is a chart that you can use as a resource as you're teaching through those sounds. Let's jump to fluency here. Teaching fluency has a lot to do with accuracy, self-correction, but this idea of flow and fluency. Now, I took a very basic song. Many of you probably know the song, The bear looked over the mountain, the bear came over the mountain, the bear came over the mountain to see what he could see. This was a childhood song that I grew up with. I don't know if any of you have. But what I did in order to make it work to develop and teach more fluency is to insert other verbs that deal with the same meaning. Looked, considered, admired, ran up, came up, arrived, near me, inspected, searched, examined. I could throw much more complex words, and you see those listed here. I could throw those into the song and have the kids learn to read by singing a song with a greater variety of vocabulary. And it goes like this, and if you allow me to sing to you, the bear looked over the mountain, the bear considered the mountain, the bear admired the mountain, I hope he doesn't see me. I hope he doesn't see me. I hope he doesn't see me. The bear ran up to the mountain, the bear came over the mountain, the bear arrived at the mountain. I hope he isn't near me. I hope he isn't near me. I hope he isn't near me. The bear inspected the mountain. The bear searched all through the mountain. The bear examined the mountain. I hope he doesn't find me. I hope he doesn't see me. I hope he isn't near me. The bear looked over the mountain. The bear ran up to the mountain. The bear inspected the mountain. I hope he doesn't find me. Thanks for bearing with me with that song, but I wanted you to see that as we learn to sing and recite poetry, we increase fluency with students. Inserting vocabulary into familiar songs and poems, we can extend the fluency of students. And hopefully that will also extend into their writing as well. But that's another story. Let's move on. All right, you're probably wondering about this big question. I came to hear about critical thinking, and I'm hearing about sounds and letter recognition and so on. What do critical thinking and foundational reading have in common? Let's look at this. A couple of researchers, Macmillan and Gentile, they advocated for reading instruction and wide opportunities to read to help teach critical thinking to children in early grades. In other words, we're talking about reading for reading's sake. If you want to learn how to ride a bicycle, you've got to get on that bike and ride and be shaky at first, but continue to ride and ride. And we advocate that with reading. The more independent, self-selected reading that students can be involved in, the more it will help their reading, but it also helps teach critical thinking. It also does this. Let's go on. Hickey in 1988 argued that critical thinking and reading readiness can be developed as early as kindergarten through questions, games, and other activities. And I would add through poetry and song. Questions has a lot to do with it, where we ask students, what did you picture in your mind? What were you thinking as you read? As you read that story, or as I read it to you, what did you think? What did you picture in your mind? Where did you see that in the story? You could also ask, is that correct? Are you sure? How do we know that's true? These questions can be asked at any level. We can ask students to play games where they're doing a game board where they're asking questions about a story they've just read. And they're deciding whether these might be true or false, and then trying to justify what that's about. Let's move on. What fosters reading and critical thinking? And these are 4 areas that I've identified that I think contribute tremendously to critical thinking and quality reading in the classroom. First of all, is our reading integrated into what students are learning? And is it interconnected across the curriculum? These are huge issues of how we teach and how we develop our reading instruction. And I'm going to talk more in detail about this. In terms of teaching reading, we want our reading to be more and more complex. But the primary way to increase that complexity is to develop rich context for our reading. And I'll talk about how you develop that rich context. Differentiated instruction. You already saw an evidence of that where I had those performance level descriptors at 3 different levels. I find that if we differentiate our instruction at three levels, it's something that as a teacher I can have I can kind of get my mind around 3 levels. If I start to deal with more levels, I tend to lose that focus when I'm trying to teach. But if I can see that I have a student, he's operating at grade level, at level 3, that's great. Is there a developmental level going on here that we need to address? Or is there a completely undeveloped area that we need to address. I think getting a hold of those three in my mind as I'm teaching helps me understand where I need to help the students. And then the fourth level, or the fourth area that fosters, is having a culture in a classroom for critical thinking. And I'll be discussing that further in just a moment. But it deals with the issue of a culture of inquiry, of creativity, of taking risks. And I think that's so vital in our world today, where we feel free to ask, is this true? Does this make sense? Where did the evidence come from? And having that sense of skepticism until we've got some rational explanation or some supports for the thinking that's going on. So let's look closer at each of these four areas. Integrated and interconnected. When I'm talking about this, foundational reading skills apply in an interconnected way across the curriculum. And I'll show an example of that, where it's touching on each of our subject areas, where students are engaged in reading, not only in the reading class, but in their history, social science classes, in their science class, in their math class, and maybe they're reading the same types of levels of text and making that happen. There's a discipline specific vocabulary to each aspect of the curriculum. Let me give an example. In PE, in physical education, we talk about blocking. Blocking happens in our sports where a football player is blocking out another opponent to keep them from getting to the ball. But in the arts, like in theater and drama, blocking means something entirely different. Blocking means setting the stage so that when someone looks at the stage, there's a focus to it. The actors are blocked in such a way so that the main speaker captures the attention of the eye. There's two different words, two different meanings of the same word there. And understanding that each discipline has its own specific vocabulary will really help that sense of developing reading and thinking. Let me also add that skills do not stand in isolation, but are used within disciplines, within specific contexts. We want to bring these together and surround our words, and I'll be talking more about the contextual piece. But oftentimes we think if we just teach words in isolation, we'll have a collection of words. But they hang together in a discipline, in a context, so it makes much more sense to integrate that vocabulary instruction in an interconnected way. Something else that integrating our reading instruction does is it fosters a sense of comparison and comparing how do we use words in a math book? How do we use words in a science report? How do we use words in a narrative in history? And how do we use words in poetry and the arts? There's a comparison there of discourse styles and of perceptions and meaning. And teaching our reading across these subject areas helps foster that sense of comparative thinking, which allows us to think critically about what we're learning. Let's move on. This is an example of integrating instruction. At the center of this is exploring Mars. We're going to study exploring Mars, okay? Look what's happening in language arts. We're listening, speaking, reading, and writing about Mars exploration. In math, we're studying Mars, But we're thinking in terms of measurements. What's the distance that's being traveled? What's the difference in size between the planet Mars and the Earth, for example? We're making these calculations and formulas and functions. But there's an overlapping connection between what we're listening about, what we're speaking about, what we're reading about, and what we're writing. In science, we're doing more exploring. For example, the surface. How is the surface of Mars different from the surface of Earth? We're hypothesizing. Was there water there? What did it look like? What parts of the planet does water appear? We're testing theories. We're creating models. And in each of those experiences, notice that there's a connection between listening, speaking, reading and writing, calculations, measurements, and exploring, hypothesizing, testing theories, creating models. Let's go across to history, social science. We ask these questions of what is the historical context? Of when did people first discover about the planet Mars? What was some of the initial thinking about that planet? Who contributed to that knowledge? And where are we headed in the future? Is exploration of Mars a real possibility or not? Again, this involves language arts, science, mathematics, history, social science, and our reading. And in the arts, are we creating models such as the science models, but how artistically are we creating those? What's our creative expression about this? I want to acknowledge some colleagues from South Africa who, when they get done with a science lesson or a science unit, they finish off, instead of an exam, they use a praise poem, and they have the students compose a poem about their learning, combining the language arts, the arts, and their science instruction, bringing those together. And again, what holds this and creates our thinking is questioning strategies, of asking, what is this? How could it be different? Problem posing. How long do you think it would take to actually fly to Mars at a certain speed? Finding solutions and calculating those things. And then evaluating your results at the end and saying, am I doing this correctly? Is there a better way to do this? Is my information accurate? Would I have a different conclusion with other information? Let's continue on. Context supports complexity. I've mentioned this several times already, and let's talk about this more in detail. Anytime we can supply visuals. This is a picture from the surface of Mars. That provides some context. But one of the things that I think is a very important rule that anytime we're using visuals is to show the picture first, label it second. Developmentally, the words here, pyramid structure, are abstract. If I were to just show you the words pyramid structure first, the image would not come to mind like this. You begin to see, oh yeah, that looks like a pyramid now. But first, you want to just see and take in the picture. Then follow with a label. Another aspect that provides context is to have actual items to look at, to handle if possible, or possibly models that reflect what the actual item looks like. But that allows us to tap into the senses. Real objects allow us to think of things in terms of what are the dimensions. Look at how this measures in terms of a coin. So we get to see what size these objects are. Also, when we tap into the senses, we increase retention and understanding of what it is we're talking about. This is context development. Something else that develops context in a very easy way is utilizing the drawings of our own students. I used to spend a lot of time trying to create and capture images. What I found, it increased understanding and knowledge and also an appreciation in a group. When the students were allowed the privilege of sharing their pictures to help teach the others, I would have students illustrate a concept, and then I would talk to them, the individual student, and say, this really gets across an important point. Can we share this with the rest of the class? And once I had the student's permission, then you could see the student beam that I'm using their work to show and provide context to what we're reading about. Let's continue. Another way that we enrich context is by using vivid resources. For example, here, Deborah Shear provided this wonderful book on exploring Mars, and it's full of vivid illustrations and wonderful pictures that are highlighted that help students understand what's being talked about. Anytime that we can provide attractive resources, we're in really good shape. I'll be getting more into that when we get into a lesson here. The third aspect of developing critical thinking with reading is to provide differentiated instruction. And like I said, we've done a division between the three performance levels of reading, the basic reading. And within those levels, we think of, first of all, the types of questions we ask. A student who's at the level 1 is not going to be able to provide a rich narrative of what they're talking about. So maybe the questions I should ask should be more either-or types of questions. Either-or questions embed the answer. For example, is this rock from Mars or is it from Earth? Do you hear how the answer is embedded in the question and the student can say from Mars? An open-ended question might be for a higher level student. Where do you think this rock comes from? There's an open-ended level question, and they can supply the words. But then we can also ask questions that spur thinking. How do you know that this rock came from Earth versus Mars? That takes you to a whole different level. The tasks that we ask students to do. For example, in writing, I may ask a level 1 student to dictate to me, and I act as the scribe for their ideas. Or maybe another student is a scribe because they have trouble writing. A level 2 student I may ask to only write a couple of sentences about what they're doing. A level 3 students, I may ask them to write a full paragraph or a topic sentence with supporting sentences. I differentiate these tasks not to reduce the rigor of the task, but to meet the level of where the students are, to push them to the next level. The student products will be differentiated as well. Maybe the presentations that I ask them to do will be slightly different. I may ask multiple facets of a presentation. For example, in a presentation for a level 3 student, I'm looking for 4 examples that support your thinking. For a level 2 student, I say I'm looking for 2 examples of what supports your thinking. And a level 1 student, I'm looking for them to draw a picture of an example of something that supports their thinking. Changing those products will help the students in their increasing participation. And then differentiation in instruction Differentiated instruction employs formative assessment of student performance. That's where those performance level descriptors are so helpful, because I can evaluate what kind of performance is going on, where do I need to go next. And I can adjust those assessments to the task itself. And I'll show an example of that in a moment. Here's some more applicable strategies. We're going to discuss selected, vividly illustrated text, as I mentioned earlier. We can allow those level 1 students, those beginning students, to point to pictures and images that help their thinking. We can ask students to sketch their ideas. We can have them work with partners, so that maybe one partner helps supply the words for another that they're thinking. One of the ways I like to do this is to engage students in active listening. And I'll pose a question. For example, how did you know that this rover traveled 40 miles a day? Talk to each other about this. And then the next question I ask is, don't tell me what you were thinking. Tell me what your partner said. That engages a student in active listening and fact-checking. Is that what you really meant? And it also engages them in listening and speaking in a way that contributes to critical thinking. Let's go on. Notice this leveled instruction, where I'm asking students to illustrate what their thinking is. A level 1 student, I may ask them to map out what's gone on in a drawing, in a series of drawings. And in this level 1 student, I didn't ask them to label their drawings. This is going to be a visual and oral exercise. A level 2 student would be asked to write and illustrate, but just briefly. A level 3 student, I'm going to ask for more detail. Ask them to have more explanation in what their writing is. This shows a difference in products, differentiated tasks, and it helps me understand what the thinking is behind what's gone on. Let's move on. What fosters critical thinking? First of all, critical thinking is fostered in a culture of inquiry and imagination. I always think of that famous quote by Albert Einstein, his imagination is more powerful than knowledge. Just knowing facts is not enough, but imagining possibilities and asking questions about that. When we read to explore new ideas, see that integration going on there? Let's learn something new. Where are we going to find out about that? That leads into identifying quality sources. Critical thinking and reading really go together well. We're not just accepting something because it's on the internet. We're checking the reliability and the accuracy of these sources in multiple ways. And that begins with identifying where did we get our information from. Could you imagine asking the question, where does electricity come from? Does it come from the wall socket? We have to work further back from there. In the same way with our reading and our research, identify where these sources come from. If you read something online, what was the source of that piece of information? Along those same lines is exploring the background and context of an issue. And this is more than just identifying sources, but if we're getting back to this idea of studying Mars, that whole concept of where did we get the notion of Mars? Why did we call it Mars? What did Greek gods have to do with this? Where's the context for what we're thinking? When we foster critical thinking, we celebrate the idea of questioning our initial assumptions. I think it's this way. Oh, really? Why? How? Testing our theories. And let me just take a moment to talk about testing theories. Theoretical thinking begins with metaphorical thinking. I hold up a broken shard of rock, and I begin to ask these questions. What does this remind me of? What is this like? That one picture I showed earlier of the pyramid structure, that's metaphorical thinking, that rock there looked like a pyramid. That's the beginning of testing a theory. Oh, is it like a pyramid? How is that? Let's test that. Let's compare this to a real pyramid. How is it the same? How is it different? So that initial questioning of assumptions and also testing our theories fosters that critical thinking. Trying to argue both sides of an issue. This is where you pose a problem and ask students to argue against themselves. Create the strongest argument they possibly can, and then turn around and create the strongest argument against their thinking. This allows us also to consider new alternatives. Is there another way to learn about this? Is there another way to think about this idea? And finally, to be reflective, skeptical about our conclusions. To never really assume that we have all the answers. And to think about, gee, how can I learn about this more? Let's move on. What I've done here, and by the way, the link that I provided to these resources, you're going to see a tab that says e-resources, electronic resources. If you click on that tab, then you can download these things for free. That's where that all is. What I've done here is I've developed a full lesson that includes every component of what I've just talked about. This is a lesson on, guess what? Studying Mars. It's a 4th grade lesson. I'll be addressing differentiated skills, levels 1, 2, and 3. The subject area will be reading informational texts and craft and structure. We'll also include some word recognition and phonics in there. And then I've aligned this with standards. I've got one standard related to reading. They're reading a grade level text with purpose and understanding, and one related to thinking. Explain how the author uses reasons and evidence to support particular points in the text. And here's the task we're going to be doing. Students explain how the author uses reasons and evidence in his book Discovering Mars, The Amazing Story of the Planet, to support particular points regarding the topology of the planet. Let's continue on through this lesson. This lesson is going to have 3 parts to it. Preliminary information that you just saw. It's going to have part B, the procedures and the differentiated strategies, including key vocabulary. And then part C, what are the outcomes of this lesson and what kind of assessment am I using? So I've broken this up in the next few slides to kind of hold your thinking. So think about this in terms of part A, part B, part C. We've already talked about part A somewhat. We're continuing with part A. Here's my materials and resources. And this is a fabulous resource here. Mars is from JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and NASA. And you'll notice some of the materials that I'm going to be using red and blue cellophane and glue and scissors to make 3D glasses. Because at JPL, at Jet Propulsion Laboratories, they want you to look at some of the images there in 3 dimensions. Think about having kids read with 3D, how that's going to get them excited about reading. Let's go into part B of this lesson, and we'll start by introducing the lesson, and look at how I'm introducing the lesson. I'm beginning with music, having the students listening to Gustav Holst's The Planets, The Bringer of War, Mars. And as they're doing this, I have them explore Jet Propulsion Laboratory and their website. If I had time, if we had a few hours, we would click on that website and go there and explore it. It's really quite something. And I would ask them to search for information about Mars in terms of what's in the news. What is new ideas that you've learned about Mars? What are some graphics and videos that are interesting? And what are you learning about volcanoes? Something specific. And I'll allow 10 minutes for the students to develop context, exploring a scientific website that is designed for education in children. It's absolutely free. And this is all before we get into the actual reading. But they're going to be doing a heck of a lot of reading on that website. I'm showing this because this is what's supplied from the website is a template for creating 3D glasses. Isn't that something? And you can have the kids make these ahead of time and put blue and red cellophane over these so they can get that 3D look to them. I just thought I'd share that as a free resource. Before we get into the reading, I'm going to teach the vocabulary. And this is going to be discipline-specific vocabulary. We're going to deal with the words Mars, red planet, surface, mammoth volcanoes, mount, and mons. Where do those words come from? Because these are key words in the text. In order to learn about Mars, we're going to find out about the Greek god of war and learn about the background of how different planets are named after different Greek gods, such as Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. With the red planet, I'm going to show images from Jet Propulsion Laboratory's website to see the red dirt of that planet. We're also going to look at a brief video using our 3D glasses that shows the different contours and the surface of the planet. See how that changes. There's also a section where we look up on Google Images the idea of mammoth websites or mammoth volcanoes on Earth and also in Mars. And many of these features didn't use English to be named. They used French and English to identify the different names, such as Mount Olympus or Mons Olympus, for the different names on the planets. Now we're ready to begin reading. I've built lots of context. I've asked them to do all kinds of activities. Now we're ready to begin to read. But we're going to read for a purpose, remember. It's not just reading words, but there's a particular purpose. I've also differentiated how we're going to read here. Option 1, or level 1 students, can sit with me, the teacher, and follow along as I read aloud. Option 2, students can be buddy reading with each other, where they take turns reading paragraphs so they don't get tired. Option 3 is you can read independently if you're ready to do that. And here's the purpose for the reading. I'm going to ask them to find information, cite resources, and record the supporting data for each of their points. And then I'm going to ask them to go back to that JPL website and see if there's a comparison between those. I'm going to move on quickly through this lesson. The final product that I'm going to ask them to do is to make a presentation about their reading. And they're going to use either PowerPoint or Prezi or Flash. And I'm going to ask them to have 3 or 4 points of information, supporting information, accompanying images that support that information, and I want citations. I want them to know their sources. And I've differentiated these products according to levels. Level 1, you meet with the teacher and listen to the text aloud. You contribute to that information and evidence with the group orally, and you contribute to the collaborative digital presentation. Level 2 works with a partner to read the text. Together they complete information and an evidence worksheet, and they continue working with partners, or they can join a larger group to create the digital presentation. Level 3, I'm going to ask them to partner up after reading individually and to create their presentation. And I'm looking for 2 to 4 other students to discuss and justify their thinking about their results. These are the different student outcomes differentiated according to each level. You can see that. And these provide information for my assessment. Once I've decided exactly what I'm looking for each student at each level, then I can create an assessment tool. And here's my assessment tool, where I'm looking for what level 1 students are doing, level 2 and level 3, in terms of foundational reading, in terms of thinking, and also in terms of the quality of their presentation. Summative assessment tells us what happened after the fact. But I want us to concentrate on more formative assessment that provides teachers with information about individual students, that shows us what we need to do to accommodate our instruction. And that's what that assessment is right there. We're running out of time here, so I'm going to finish right up. Just to summarize, we develop reading with an integrated, interconnected approach. Context supports complexity, differentiated instruction, and developing a classroom culture for critical thinking. Again, these are all available in my latest book, but that link that I've given you, if you look under the tab that says e-resources, you'll be able to get access to all of these things. Thank you so much for the time. I hope we have a little bit of time left over for some questions.
Thank you, Professor Boyd-Batstone, for this really interesting presentation and for giving our participants this complete list of resources that they can use in the classroom with their students. So while we wait for the questions that the participants have, I have a specific one that has to do with the role of the parents or the families within this whole process of, developing the critical thinking skills through reading comprehension. So I want to know from your experience, your vast experience in different contexts, how parents can contribute to this process.
That's a great question, and I'm so glad you brought that up. I didn't deal with that directly in this presentation, but I've worked with parents in a whole range of abilities. But let's begin with those parents who are illiterate, who don't read. How can you engage them in this? And when I meet with parents and they wonder, how can I help my child become a better reader? What I tell them to do is the following. Sit with your child as they read. That's number 1. Be present. Let them read aloud to you. And as you read aloud, ask them some questions. Basic questions. Like, what were you thinking as you were reading? You don't have to be literate. You don't have to be able to read to be able to ask that question. Another question you can ask is, you can point to a word on the page and say, what does that word mean? Do you know? And if the child says, no, I don't know, then say, go ask your teacher to help teach you that word and come back and teach me that word too. Something else that you can ask while you're sitting with your child is, what did you picture in your mind as you read? I love that question because it opens up to imagination. Or, is there something else that you'd like to read? Think about those types of questions, and that can take a person a long way, even though they may not even be literate in their own language. I also encourage parents to talk to their kids about their reading in their home language. It doesn't help to have a stilted conversation if they don't speak English. It's better that they're talking in their own language because thinking is thinking and reading is reading. Other questions?
Thank you, Professor Boyd-Batstone. I have another question concerning like the different contexts that you have worked in. For example, in bilingual or trilingual families, how is that this process of developing critical thinking skills through reading can be, assessed and also developed? If you have like families where the mother tongue of the mother is one, of the father is another one, and of the kid, in the context of the country he or she has been growing up, like challenges this processes of learning.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the fundamental ways that we begin with this is story. I think it's a fabulous task, a fabulous homework task, to ask children to go home and invite their parents to tell them a story. Let me give you an example. One of my students at one time was reading a story in English that was kind of mystical. It had almost like a ghost characteristic to it. And so I asked her to go home and uncover if there were any ghost stories in her family from either side, and to listen to those stories and come back and write about those with us. Now she came back with a wealth of stories. In fact, the parents came back to me the following week and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, we're sitting around the kitchen table till late hours of the night telling stories to each other now. And she's taking notes and coming back to the class. And I was able to say, look what I'm doing, and show the parents back the writing that this child was doing based upon the rich wealth of knowledge of the stories. When I work with the Cambodian population, this was after the killing fields, and all the texts were burned. So what we did is we tapped into the oral traditions of of the families there. They had a character called Judge Rabbit, and they had hundreds of stories that were related to this character, Judge Rabbit. And we asked them to teach us those stories, and we use those stories as the basis for our literacy development with the students. There's a whole range of ways you can do this. Let me just give one more example. I'm going to go to the area of mathematics. I asked my students, I gave them a division problem in mathematics, and I said, here's your homework for the night. You have one division problem. But the way you're going to do this problem is you're going to ask your parents how they would solve it. And one of the things that we learned is that algorithms are culturally determined. We came back to school the next day. The kids had done their homework, and we had 5 different culturally determined algorithms for solving division. And we turned that into a time of critical thinking and comparative thinking. What allowed us to solve this problem accurately? Which algorithm allowed us to solve this problem quickest? Which algorithm helped us understand the whole process of what division was about? And then I wrote back to the parents and I said, you can use your own algorithms in doing the math homework. And your children can use your algorithms on the test as well. You can see how this taps into the resources and the funds of knowledge that the families bring to us.
Thank you, Professor Paul. It seems that two of our participants had to go,
Okay.
and we only have Rosa Tobier with us now, and it's also 1 p.m. already here. So I guess we have reached, the end of the presentation. However, I don't want to say goodbye yet. I want to let people know that the materials that were used in this presentation, that include the synopsis, the PowerPoint presentation, and also the recording of this video, will be posted on our ITEN virtual community of practice under the group Critical Thinking, and we will also make available the recording in our YouTube channel at ITEN. Thank you so much, Professor Paul Boyd-Batstone, for this really interesting presentation. And thank you so much for the participants that were with us today, and also that registered for this webinar but couldn't join us in live stream. I'll see you tomorrow, Professor Paul Boyd-Batstone, for our Spanish session. And another participants have typed down on the chat. It was an interesting session, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay.
Ciao.